The next question that we actually asked participants was whether it would be appropriate for someone who knows about the incident but was not the victim, meaning a third party, to actually raise the specific incident of sexual harassment on their own social media account. Now, numerically, this data is the direct opposite. So this time, 56.3% said no, and 43.8% said yes. So when we look at this, you will find that the people who opposed third parties posting on social media about this, the rationale they provided included these 4 primary points. First, it's not your story to tell. So 20% of the respondents took the view that it's not your story, so why are you telling it? Second, to ask you to think about the victim and to understand that the victim themselves may not be ready to talk about this, and how can you protect the victim from any negative impact. Mira's point about, having to be re-traumatized because you're doing this. Third, whether you have checked with the victim for approval, are you posting details about this? And fourth, what is the depth of your knowledge? And here, an interesting point was made by 4 or 5 different respondents, was this is hearsay. So I'd actually like to invite Danny to talk about this, but the angle here, Danny, is that you've actually been providing people with counseling, and you've been listening to people talk about the things that they have gone through over the years. And what do you think about these considerations? How do you think they are relevant, and what should we be thinking about?
Thank you, Santi, and thank you, ATC, for inviting me to this talk. I think to the question of whether I would post a third party's story, that would depend on the purpose, right? And we all, when we hear stories from another person and all that, then if you want to spread that story, you need to think about what is the purpose of you doing this, right? For me, there is strength in knowing that you are not the only person who is experiencing or has experienced sexual harassment. And sometimes when you see that, someone is helping to post for you, and you see reactions to that story, and you find out that somebody else has experienced something similar, you do feel that, oh my goodness, like I'm not alone, right? And that is precisely why the Me Too movement has gotten so much attention and has spread all over, including Malaysia, because it is such a common thing that affects so many people around the world. And it's even more empowering when you find a connection between your story and another person's story, and how you feel and how you wish that no one else would have to go through the same thing. So that is an important consideration for me. Secondly, to that question about, it is not their story, that's true to a certain extent, but sometimes it's actually everyone's story. And of course, you need to be careful about the details and all that, right? You will actually be surprised by how many people who have seen or experienced similar incidents once you actually speak up. So an example was that, many years ago, I was once sexually harassed myself by a driving instructor. So this was easily 15, 16 years ago, right? And what he did was that he rubbed his hand on my thigh, and in order to teach me how gears are supposed to work. And he said, gear kena smooth macam ni, like, gears are supposed to be smooth like this. And I never really shared this story for many years, and I've tried to bury it deep inside in my memories. Don't want to remember it, but I had a conversation once with a friend just very recently, and when I told her the story, she said that she was also sexually harassed by her driving instructor. And get this, that incident took place about 8 years apart or so from mine. So easily, 20 to 30 years ago, right? And I'm sure there are others as well. So when you tell the story, right, and you realize that, my goodness, there are so many people who are experiencing the same issue, then yes, it is important to tell that story. Do you need, to the question of whether you need the survivor's consent, I would say yes. And especially if you are giving out details that would identify either the survivor or the perpetrator or related information, right? And this goes back to, of course, what Sinyo was saying earlier about the risk of defamation, because you need to be prepared for that. You need to be prepared that once you speak up, right, um, you need to be prepared for backlash, not just against yourself, but also against the survivor. So I would suggest limiting the information and taking out the details unless, of course, there's a specific intent to publicize the story as part of a strategy. But this should be subject to, you should obtain legal advice to that. But otherwise, talk to the survivor, because you're as a third party, right? You're actually sharing the story on behalf of another person, so you need to be careful about that. And is the survivor even ready to have their story being shared all over, right? So that's what I think.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for sharing that story about what happened to you. I think, and if you look at the comments, I'll invite the panelists to look at the comments. The comments are rather interesting in whether social media should be the main avenue, recognizing that people will not go to social media immediately, that often it is their last recourse. And then, of course, the inevitable, people want to forget that this incident ever happened. So, Sinyu, for you. So I'm going to share now the next slide, which actually shows the perspective of people who said that it's okay for a third party to post other people's sexual harassment incidents on social media. So 43.8% said yes. I'm sorry, just ignore that. Panelist questions will be directed to you here. Sorry. So, and the justification, one, to create awareness, which of course seems to be an underlying theme in everything that we're discussing this evening. Second, that you will be helping a friend and you are a proxy to your friend, which goes back to, I think, everyone's point about how much details you share. And what I thought was a really interesting comment from several respondents who said that maybe you would find solutions on social media. The question to you, Sinyu, is actually, just now you talked about the victim themselves sharing. What is the perspective? It's a third party sharing, the defamation, all of that again. Is there a difference if it's a third party as opposed to the victim themselves?
Thanks, Santi. Before I answer that question, it's just got me thinking that why is it that when it comes to commenting or posting on sexual harassment, there seems to be this restraint, you see, there's this self-restraint from us talking about it. But when it comes to any other incident of any other wrongdoing, we seem quite readily to comment without having the same restraint. It's as though when it comes to talking about sexual harassment, it's a taboo. I honestly, I don't see the difference between sexual harassment and any other form of wrongdoing. So that's a question that maybe we will discover one day. Mandy, I paused because I think I said something wrong. Sorry.
No, there's no wrong. But
okay, there's no wrong.
Yeah. No,
okay,
but I think, would you like to deal with Mandy's specific point? Maybe because it's harder to
we
prove.
can mention names. We can mention names. Okay,
well,
okay.
It's a public chat, so yeah.
Okay, all right. But it's the same with every other form of crime. In fact, there are some other crimes or wrongdoings that are harder to prove. But we still talk about it without the same restraint. So anyway, to answer your question, Santi, it's the same, with the exception of privilege. And also, there could be some considerations of intention, you see. Let's put it this way. If it's true, again, the golden rule is if it's true, you don't have to, and you can prove it, there's nothing to worry about. If you are not the complainant, you may not enjoy the same qualified privilege that a complainant or a victim may have. Okay, so you have to bear that in mind. One defense against defamation is not available to you. And you would also have to, in a way, consider why you're posting it. Because when it comes to cases of defamation, if you post something in good faith, you would be able to say that what you had posted is a fair comment of an incident which is of public interest or which is of interest. So that defense would be available to you, especially, you again, it's very hard to explain through a webinar, but if you comment on someone else's incident and you comment it tastefully without really disparaging the reputation and character of the perpetrator, you could perhaps say that that is a fair comment. But if you done it with the intention to damage the goodwill and reputation of the perpetrator or of the target, then that defense would not be available to you. So that in a nutshell, and this is really an oversimplification of defamation laws, but that's in a nutshell the difference between a victim coming out and someone else talking about it.
What about hearsay?
Hearsay is...
Yeah, so
it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's more of a, for me, that's more of a moral consideration than it is a defamation consideration. One way that hearsay could be relevant is perhaps that before you post, did you check? Did you do your due diligence? But that really goes into the element of intention and good faith. Whether something was posted.
But Sin I must add what you said just now is justification is a form of defense if you have evidence. But the problem is, most survivors or victims, if I would say, have no evidence because they're on their own when it happened. So that is, so documentation,
So if I can comment on that, okay, because we live in the age where everything is captured, social media, WhatsApp, Facebook, we seem to detail every aspect of our life. And because when the nature of such incidents, it's private, one way to prove that the incident is true is through circumstantial evidence. So in the event something has happened, okay, an allegation of sexual harassment has occurred, what would be relevant is to look at what the victim had done immediately or close to the incident. So if a complaint has been made to her close friends or his close friends, or there's some message saying that, you're very upset about certain incident that has happened, that could act as evidence of that incident happening. Because it's only in very rare situations where something is captured on camera and the perpetrator was caught red-handed. And often the nature of sexual harassment is that, a lot of the, what we call them, microaggressions, it's very subtle, it's very subjective. But your body, you have a sixth sense of telling whether this is right or this is wrong. So those would be quite important in establishing or act as part of your defense of justification. And your own personal experience of trauma, you confiding in a close friend, you going to a psychologist, you going to a psychiatrist, you going to a counselor, all these things taken together could perhaps form justification.
Thank you, Sinu.
Very
Danny? Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, those are valid points, but I think, see, when we talk about all this, like defensive justification, fair comment, privilege, and all that, right? That means, right, you need to be prepared to go to court to argue that, right? It's not an automatic, because it was the truth, therefore you cannot sue me. That's not what it means, right? You need to be prepared for someone to actually take an action against you, and then you can argue when that happens. So I think that's what we're trying to. I think some people, may not be aware of that. Like, when you actually post something, you need to be prepared for that risk lah, basically. Doesn't mean that you're going to lose, doesn't mean that you're automatically, you're in trouble or something like that. But it does require some, you may have to spend a little bit on, appointing someone to act on your behalf. That's why I would suggest that if you're not gonna, if you don't intend to go that way, then you need to be careful about, what kind of information that you're putting out.
Okay, thank you, Danny. And actually, Danny, one of the comments, and I'm not going to name participants where their names are very identifiable. One of the questions has been that maybe social media is used as a last recourse, and because our legal system is faulty, and this might open the floodgates to vigilantism. So should we be aiming for reform in our legal system? And I think Danny, Mira, both of you have been involved in the sexual harassment bill, and here's a good chance to provide some idea about what that could entail. I know that you're governed by lots of cannot says, but yes. Can I ask Danny to please?
Yeah. So no, you're right. I wouldn't say. I think the question is like whether it should be a main avenue. I wouldn't say that lah, right? It's one of the options, and as pointed out by I think many people in the chat as well, one of the reasons why people do this is because the usual course of action doesn't really work, right? Unfortunately, and there are many reasons for that, which is why AWL, Association of Women Lawyers, and also, as part of Joint Action Group for Gender Equality, is advocating for a standalone sexual harassment bill, right? So as when we go into the steps of like what you can do, where do you go, and all that, then we will look into the different avenues that you can go to apart from social media. But you will also see that there are certain criteria that you have to meet. So for example, in order to avail of certain remedies under like, Employment Act, for example, then there needs to be like an employment context. Or if you want to avail of the civil service circular, you need to be in civil service, right? And it doesn't, if you're someone else, if you are walking on the street and you're being sexually harassed and all that, then the avenue that is available to you would be either the criminal route, as in you lodge a police report and all that, or you file a civil case if you can actually find the person, right? And that is why we want a new law that, number one, will improve the definition of sexual harassment, right? To make it as wide to cover any unwanted conduct that is sexual in nature in any form. That means can be gestural, can be verbal, can be online, can be offline as well, right? And to widen the coverage so that more people are protected from sexual harassment. Number two, we want a law that will require public and private actors. That means like, whether government or even private organizations or universities and all that, to take proactive measures. That means there's a positive duty to make sure that there is a safe environment. Currently, we don't really have that, right? What we have is, we have a code on prevention and eradication of sexual harassment. That's a voluntary basis, right? If you want to adopt it. There are some policies here and there, but those are all, they apply in different contexts, right? If you're in an organization where you happen to have a policy and mechanism, then that's great. But some organizations don't have that, right? And some private or public tertiary education institutions might not have that as well. Or in other organizations like hotels or places that you go to, restaurants. So we want that, like a positive duty. Number 3 is we are asking, for this bill to enhance protection and access to justice. And what that means is, like, number 1, that complaints are dealt expediently, that you don't need to spend money or that much money to, appoint lawyers and, file cost papers and do all that, which can take time and cost. And that complaints are to be dealt with within defined timelines, that they are heard in private, and that they are heard by a panel who have experience in dealing with sexual harassment issues. So there's a degree of sensitivity that you need in dealing with these cases, right? You need to understand the context and the power dynamics and all that when it comes to sexual harassment. And the 4th one is to allow complainants to seek remedies, such as like compensation or even a restraining order or injunction, or even just an apology or even counseling to basically as part of the redress for sexual harassment, which currently, if you go through the different avenues, you don't really, there are different ways of doing it. So like if you go through the criminal route, for example, you lodge a police report, then the most likely outcome will be imprisonment or fine for the perpetrator, but not necessarily anything for you. Civil case, then you could claim for damages for yourself, but that's depending on what is being advised and all that. And as for like internal mechanisms, that depends on the organization or where you are. Like, let's say you're complaining against a university, for example. So there are different remedies of doing it. So it's the new law or the new bill is meant to complement the existing laws, not to replace it. So it's like basically giving sort of like enhanced protection to people.
Thank you, Danny. Mira, is there anything you would like to add about why we need reform in this area specifically?
Just 1 or 2 sentences. I just want to say that legislation alone is insufficient. Of course, legislation will force organizations, institutions, universities to set up guidelines, policies, and redress mechanisms, and also they are forced to ensure it's a free, sexual harassment free area. But we cannot stop there. We need to create awareness about it, and that starts with education. Education starts from young too. The respect for your fellow human being, it starts with that. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Mira. There are some other questions which I think we will appropriately deal with in the next segment of our discussion.